Hi, everybody. My name is Elliot Marseille at Health Strategies International in Oakland. And I have been working in the area of economic appraisal of global health programs for the last quarter of a century or so. And I have also long been interested in ethics. And I'm excited to be able to talk to you today about two passions of mine: cost effectiveness analysis and ethics. So what's the problem? There's an idea out in the world that economists live in a realm of abstraction, that their models and analyses are divorced from common sense. And worse than that, economic logic can lead one to divorce oneself from one's own common humanity. Cost-effectiveness analysis and cost-benefit analysis, because they translate human welfare into quantitative terms and value health interventions according to return on investment types of metrics, is very much a target of this kind of criticism and even suspicion. I believe that economists, policy analysts, and policymakers are sometimes intimidated by these criticisms. In any case, they don't have a systematic way of thinking about the intersection of efficiency, i.e., cost-effectiveness analysis, and ethics. And they're therefore unsure of how to respond to critics who want to reject the findings of cost-effectiveness analyses in favor of equity, human rights, or other ethical principles. So here are the goals of this presentation. First, I want to introduce you to the ethical foundations of cost-effectiveness analysis, namely a branch of ethics called utilitarianism. I want to stimulate you to think about ethical arguments pertaining to resource allocation in a systematic way. And finally, I want to persuade you that utilitarianism, as expressed in cost-effectiveness analysis, is usually the right basis for resource allocation decisions. Well, actually, pertaining to number 3, not exactly. I'm happy to persuade you, but that's not really my goal. My goal is to stimulate you to engage with my argument and reject it or modify it as you will, but be explicit about your reasoning. I do not claim to have solved the problem of what is ethical in resource allocation, but at the same time, I do want to advance an argument that utilitarianism is, as I say, usually a good guide to resource allocation decisions. So what is utilitarianism? It has recently been re-Christianed by Joshua Green in a book called Moral Tribes, deep pragmatism, because utilitarianism has such a cold and technocratic ring to it. So I like deep pragmatism, and I will be referring to utilitarianism and deep pragmatism more or less interchangeably in the remainder of this presentation. There are many branches of ethical thought, and the broader school from which deep pragmatism or utilitarianism derives is called consequentialism. And the idea here is that actions should be judged actions should be judged by their outcomes, not by the intentions of the actors, or by how well the actions adhere to some abstract moral principle. So we're interested in actual results in the world as best we can predict them. Utilitarianism was first articulated by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill in the 1800s, elaborated on by others. And here's the essence of it. Here's the maxim of utilitarianism. It is, act in such a way as to generate the maximum amount of well-being, happiness, or what economists refer to as utility, as you can. That's the goal, is human well-being, human flourishing, happiness, or utility. So what does this mean in the context of global health? Well, it implies at least 3 things. One is that scarce resources should be allocated so as to maximize overall health benefit. such as deaths averted or quality-adjusted life years gained. That's the idea. Maximize human flourishing, maximize well-being. A second one is that all lives have the same value. Human well-being is human well-being, and there's no basis within utilitarianism, within deep pragmatism, for distinguishing between identified and statistical lives. And finally, there's no special claim for alleviating inequality, except to the extent that privileging poor people, targeting those with less resources or less access to health care, is an efficient way to maximize overall benefit. As a purely practical matter, the fact that we aren't privileging the poor or those with less access to care may not have as big an impact as it sounds, because in most cases, it will be most cost-effective to intervene on behalf of the poor and on behalf of those with less access to care, because at the margin, new resources will make the biggest difference for them, which is what we mean by something being cost-effective. I now want to talk about ethical principles that are different from, and in fact, mainly competing with utilitarianism. And I want to use as a foil for this part of the presentation a really terrific paper that was published in Health Affairs in 2012 by Macklin and Cowan called "Given Financial Constraints, It Would Be Unethical to Divert Antiretroviral Drugs from Treatment to Prevention." I say this paper is terrific because it does a great job of outlining key ethical principles that people refer to in global health and providing clear definitions. So here's the issue that they raise. There's limited funds for intervening with HIV in a high prevalence country, let's say. And the budget for antiretroviral drugs is insufficient to provide both prevention through PrEP and treatment through direct provision of antiretroviral drugs to positive people. So there's a trade-off here. You can't treat everybody, and the question then is, how do you divide this limited resource between prevention and treatment? And what is the ethical basis for making that trade-off? Okay. So here are the competing ethical principles that Macklin and McCown outline in their paper. First, they talk about utilitarianism, which, as you know, is the maximization of health benefit. Second, rule of rescue. An identified person in need of medical care gets the first claim. Urgent need, similar but a little different from rule of rescue. It's the idea that those who have an affliction that requires the greatest urgency have a greater claim on resources than those whose need is less urgent. Equal worth. Since all lives have the same intrinsic value, the same care must be offered to everyone. Equity. Here the idea is that you want to divide resources so that outcomes are distributed as equitably. Notice that equity is used both in the definition and in the term attempting to be defined itself. And divide resources as equitably as possible, reduce disparities in health status. Prioritarianism. Here the idea is that you want to provide resources to those who are least advantaged members of society. And then finally, rights, which was not in the Macklin and Cowan paper, but I added because it is very often cited as a principle for resource allocation in global health. And here the idea is simply by virtue of being a human being, you're entitled to certain freedoms, certain processes under law, or material goods or services such as healthcare. So here we have a number of principles, and the question is In deciding how to allocate a budget between treatment and prevention, what weight do we assign to each of these? Should balance be the goal? So if all of these principles pointed in generally the same direction, it wouldn't be that difficult a problem. It wouldn't be so hard to answer that question. But that's not true. I put together a little schematic here which shows that for the most part, these principles conflict with each other. So I've paired each principle with each of the others, and at each intersection, at each pair of principle, I've indicated whether, in my assessment, the likelihood of convergence, of agreement between the principles is high, green, low, yellow, or very low, red. And I want to say at the outset that you can agree or disagree with these assessments. There's some subjectivity here. But I argue that the area that is red or yellow is pretty well represented here. You might disagree about some of the squares. So let me tell you why, let me give you some examples of the kinds of conflicts that we're seeing here. If the rule of rescue is taken as the major or the sole criterion for resource allocation, it means that one patient or a very, very small number of patients could exhaust all the resources available and completely destroy any effort for a utilitarian outcome or even an equity-based outcome. Equity itself is kind of vague. Does it mean equal outcomes? Does it mean equality? Or does it mean justice based on some other criterion? Equal worth, in the way defined in the article, means equal inputs. So what should take priority, equal outcomes or equal inputs? Prioritarianism may easily conflict with the rule of rescue. Identified lives will often be the most visible. And who are the most visible citizens? They're often the most affluent. Urban elites can identify themselves to decision makers better than poor rural dwellers. Rights. If one group asserts a right, by definition, they claim that others have a moral imperative to provide those goods or services that are being claimed as a right. And a question may arise, at what point are the rights of those called upon to provide those resources being violated? Urgent need. What does this mean exactly? Does it mean how soon deaths from non-treatment or non-prevention will occur? Or does it mean how badly off people without treatment or a means of prevention will suffer? The former favors treatment, and the latter suggests no grounds for preferring one or the other. And rights, I would argue, is pretty much irrelevant here because it basically assumes away the trade-off. In other words, if everybody has a full moral claim to the resources at hand, then how can you make any distinctions between those who would benefit from treatment and those who would benefit from prevention? So where does that leave us? The authors say, when principles conflict, it becomes necessary to balance competing concerns. There's no correct way of achieving this balance. Why balance? And if balance is the goal, in what proportion? They've already implied that there may not be a correct way of achieving that balance. And then later we read, the ultimate goal, of course, is to achieve a utilitarian outcome, tempered by considerations of equity and urgent need. And I ask, why is that of course? If it were of course, that implies that our ordinary ethical intuitions is a sufficient guide. Why then go through the exercise of trying to apply abstract moral principles to the resource allocation decision that they pose for us, how does this help us? I say it does not. These quotes are just a restatement of the original problem. The conclusion advocated in the article, namely that treatment has a prior claim over prevention in the allocation of antiretroviral drugs for HIV, is a mere assertion based on an opaque assigning of weights to the competing ethical principles that they outlined. The unstated meta-ethical principle is that a result that highly overweights any one principle is likely to be unethical. But again, why should that be? Why is it not just as plausible that one principle should dominate? Since this question is not addressed, we are left with an ad hoc mix of principles that policymakers now use. The authors say little about the role of politics and ideology in driving resource allocation decisions. But if, as the authors say, there's no consensus on how to weight the relevant principles, decisions based on politics and ideology can be dressed up in whatever ethical clothing seems to fit. This is a description of the world we now inhabit, and it is unclear how the ideas advanced in this article put health resource allocation decisions on a more rational or more ethical foundation. So far, I've been arguing that well-articulated moral principles can conflict with each other or be irrelevant or be hard to interpret in the context of a particular resource allocation decision. I now want to argue that our everyday moral intuitions may also be of little use. And this additional trouble we're going to get from a branch of ethics or a sub-branch of ethics that's jokingly referred to as trolleyology, because they depend on a series of thought experiments involving trolley cars, which have actually become quite famous. They were originally developed by the philosopher Philippa Foot at Oxford University in the 60s and elaborated on by Judith Thomson at MIT and others. And they fell out of popularity for a while. They're kind of bizarre, they're kind of whimsical and unrealistic, perhaps, for many practical scenarios that might confront us in life. But recently, the trolley problems have been very common in the popular press, and part of the reason for their newfound life is that the problems that they confront, the paradoxes that they put forward, are the very paradoxes that the people who write software for driverless cars need to deal with, because they involve difficult moral choices. So here's the classic first trolley problem. You can see on the diagram on the left that there's a trolley, that's that rectangular object. There's nobody in the trolley, but it's heading down the track, and it is moving toward that large circle, which represents 5 people. They will be killed when the trolley hits them. And you have to accept in this thought experiment, there's no chance of somebody escaping. You have to accept the facts as I'm giving them to you here. You are at the intersection of the track and a side track, and you have the option of pulling a switch which will direct the trolley to the right, where it will hit and will kill one person. So the choice is pulling the switch and killing one, or not acting and allowing 5 people to die. Most people opt to pull the switch in this hypothetical situation, making the simple calculation that it's better for 1 person to die than for 5. Some people feel this is morally unjustified, that you can't take an action that would result, a deliberate action that would result in the death of an innocent person. Okay, but this is relatively straightforward. So here's a variation on this called the fat man. The idea here is that there's a footbridge that is that is situated over the track. And on this footbridge is a large man standing by the edge of the bridge. And you have the option to push him off the bridge. He will then land on the track and will die. But his body is sufficiently large to stop the trolley and prevent the 5 people represented by the circle from being killed. So, do you push or don't you? You're aware that the result is exactly the same as in the first case. Either 5 people die or 1 people die. Lots of people who are willing to pull the switch are not willing to push somebody off the footbridge. Why is that? Is there some particular taboo against making physical contact and pushing somebody off? And is that visceral repulsion a sound basis for moral reasoning? More trolleyology. On the left is the original diagram. I just want you to remind you of what's sort of the reference case here. It's the switch where you pull the switch, 1 person dies, you don't, 5 people die. But now, instead of an innocent fat man being pushed off a bridge, we have a fat villain. This is an evil character. In fact, he's the one who lured those 5 people to sit in the track on the way of this oncoming trolley. So now, does that change anything for you? Are you willing to push this person onto the way of the oncoming trolley? And if so, why? How do you justify that if you weren't willing to push the fat man off the footbridge? What exactly has changed? Still more trolleyology. Again, on the left, it's the same one you're used to. It's the standard switch scenario. But now we have a different situation. We have 2 trolleys that are heading for each other. And again, there's nobody in the trolley. Nobody's going to die in the trolley. If you pull the switch, they will collide. And they will roll down an embankment on the right. And they will hit this innocent man who's sleeping under a tree on the side of this hill. And it will kill him, but you'll save the 5. Does this change anything? I mean, he's not really involved, right? I mean, he's not on the track. He's not in the train yard. He's someplace else. Are you less willing for him to die than you were for the original person on the switch? Or for the fat man on the bridge? Does contemplating these possibilities begin to undermine your confidence in your everyday ethical intuitions? Wait, there's more. So this is my favorite of them, and it's a little, bear with me here. So again, on the left we have the usual switch problem. On the right we have the loop variation. So here we have somebody on the right side of the track who will be killed if you deflect the trolley. But what's different here is many people feel comfortable about the case on the left. They feel comfortable about allowing somebody to die when that person is not an instrument of saving the lives. We're not using the person in the left-hand scenario, on the switch scenario, that person is not a means to an end. They're just an incidental casualty. They're collateral damage that's required to save 5 people over 1. This is a distinction a lot of people think are important. On the right, the person who dies really is the instrument of saving the 5. Their body is what stops the trolley from reconnecting with the track and killing the 5. Now remember, it's the same 1 person dying versus the 5. And if you think this makes a difference, please tell me why. What is it about the extra piece of track that now connects back to the main track that makes this situation different? Particularly if you consider that extra piece of track is never going to be used because the person on the right is going to stop the train. So these questions raise a broader question, which is whether our ethical intuition are derived from evolutionary pressures or cultural contingency, as opposed to being rooted in some clear moral principle that you could articulate and defend. So let me return to one of the most important questions that come up in looking at the ethics of resource allocation, and we saw it in the Macklin-Cowan example of whether it's what the right moral choice is to allocate resources to those who need treatment versus those who need prevention. And that is a statistical life worth less than an identified life? So are people who need treatment somehow in a different ethical class from those who need prevention? And if so, how do you explain that? Alternatively, is preferential treatment for identified lives a function of evolution of our moral brains that evolved in the ancient savannah and was designed for our survival based on reciprocal loyalties to our tribe and community affiliations? I say that one person's statistical life is another person's identified life. Might it be valid to think about the preference for identified lives as a kind of failure of imagination? For the family and friends of the statistical life, that life is an identified life. So I have a hard time seeing how, on ethical grounds, an identified life should be favored over a statistical life. Part of the problem might be our tendency to experience empathy. And there may actually be virtue in being cold-blooded. I'm being deliberately provocative here. I'm well aware that empathy is kind of like motherhood and apple pie. How can you be against empathy? I'm not going to spend much time on this argument. I highly commend the work of Paul Bloom at Yale, who just came out with a book called Against Empathy. And I will provide some links to some of his YouTube presentations on why empathy is a bad basis for making resource allocation and other kinds of moral judgments. There's possible confusion about what I'm saying, so let me be clear about what I am not saying. I am not saying that efficiency-based cost-effectiveness, deeply pragmatic criteria are always best for resource allocation. They can sometimes lead to outcomes that I would find repugnant, you might find repugnant as well. For example, who wants to live in a world where a child is left to drown in a well because somebody figured out that rescue is not cost effective? But here's what I am saying. If you're going to make a decision, if policy is going to deviate from the results that would follow from deep pragmatism and efficiency, the trade-off should be confronted. In other words, how many lives of richer people are you willing to trade off for the life of a poor person if you want to advance the principle of equity? How many statistical lives are you willing to sacrifice for an identified life? And what about the promotion of other values, such as women's rights and empowerment versus immediate health benefit? How do you weigh those things? What I'm saying here is these are real trade-offs, period. I want to give you an example from some work that I did with Jim Kahn on the cost-effectiveness of the female condom. The idea here is that there are soft, hard to measure, but possibly substantial benefits of the female condom that we couldn't include in our cost effectiveness analysis of the female condom because we had no way of measuring them. Proponents of the female condom argue in favor of making female condoms available, even though they are much more expensive than male condoms and not more effective, because they give women autonomy in negotiating the terms of their sexual relations. It gives women rights, it gives them empowerment, and these are important values in themselves. As I mentioned, we had no way of measuring quantitatively what those benefits were, but we did have a way of thinking about how much one would need to value that in order to give up the extra health benefit that you get from investing in male condoms rather than female condoms. So we looked at 3 different risk groups: sex workers on the left, women with regular partners, and then single women who have casual partners. And if you have $100,000 to invest in condoms, the opportunity cost of investing them in female condoms is, if you look at the left part of the table, between 92 and 118 additional HIV cases. So what that means is that you would need to value women's rights or female empowerment enough to absorb an additional 92 to 118 cases of HIV for every $100,000 spent. And remember, about half of those cases, of that 92 to 118, will be women. What about their rights? So what I'm arguing here is that efficiency is not merely one criterion among many. It has its own ethical dimensions. I want to conclude with my attempt to resolve the apparent conflict between efficiency and other ethical criteria. And I'm going to use the work of Nobel Prize-winning economist Daniel Kahneman, who suggests that there are 2 sides of our nature. There's a fast brain, which is emotional, empathic, and deals with small numbers. The other side of our nature is characterized by the metaphor of a slow brain. It's rational, it's calculating, it's a bit impersonal. It deals in large numbers. And it is best exemplified by Dr. Spock. While nobody hopes or believes that we should advance to a state of Spock-like hyper-rationality, that it is undesirable and futile to deny our emotional, empathic natures, that these have important expressions in many aspects of our life, such as clinical medicine and many other areas of society pertaining to family, friends, and community, that there is another realm, the realm of global health and public health, which by definition pertains to population, large numbers, and thus is appropriate for the more abstract modes of reasoning characterized by our slow brain. What we find unacceptable is a refusal to acknowledge that trade-offs are real and consequential. It is true that a small fraction of what the world spends on armaments and on various ultra-frivolous and luxurious pursuits could, if redeployed, have huge global health benefits. But this information is of no use to the Minister of Health in a low-income country, as she decides what portion of her budget should be allocated to TB drugs and what portion should be allocated for the distribution of bed nets to control malaria. The long-term social and political project of redirecting resources away from activities that are unconducive to human flourishing and towards those that are more conducive is one of the most urgent projects of our time. However, for any meaningful time horizon, there will be insufficient money to pursue all beneficial activities. Trade-offs and the problems of resource allocation will therefore persist, deep pragmatism will usually be the most reliable guide in resolving those trade-offs. Thank you very much.